Dr. Wayne Pomerleau, a recently retired Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Gonzaga University. His specialization is history of philosophy. He's a Kantian. He's an avid film viewer, and ask him about his list of top films. Our second speaker will be Tyler Tritten, an associate professor of philosophy here at Gonzaga again, whose specialty is continental philosophy and philosophy of religion. Ask him about Dumb and Dumber and Big Lebowski, I would say, and see what he has to say about that. Our third speaker is Layne, professor of philosophy, director also of Gonzaga's philosophy graduate program. Dr. Layne is an expert in ancient philosophy and particularly interested in Plato and the late Platonic tradition, or Neoplatonism. And Karen Petruska is associate professor of communication studies. She's very interested in the history of television media and is widely published in communication studies. So, as I say, we have a great panel. We'll have presentations from each of our speakers, and then we'll let them maybe ask each other a question or two at the end of Karen's presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the very end. So I hope you'll jot down some questions as you're hearing the talks and prepare for a conversation. So, Dr. Pomerleau, if we could have you come up. Thank you.
The handout is kind of an outline designed to try to facilitate your following what I'm doing. Briefly, what I'm doing, however, is I am focusing on one particular philosopher's philosophy, that being the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, applying his philosophy to one particular character named Sir Thomas More in one particular movie called A Man for All Seasons. Before I retired, every once in a while, I would teach a course on philosophy and fiction. And I like to say near the beginning of the course that philosophy can illuminate fiction, and fiction can illustrate philosophy. So let's see. Try to make a go of that. When Dr. Calhoun first invited me to do this, I was reluctant, doubting that I could do it well enough. But as I thought about how to relate faith to film to philosophy, I became intrigued and increasingly interested. Calhoun wanted a focus on character, which is very interesting to me as a longtime ethics teacher. I thought of 3 superb movies that might do the job, all of them on the list of my 12 favorite movies ever filmed. In addition to A Man for All Seasons, which is the one that I chose, there were 12 Angry Men and To Kill a Mockingbird. All 3 of these movies have memorable and admirable protagonists of strikingly fine character. That protagonist, or hero if you prefer, in the case of A Man for All Seasons, is Sir Thomas More. He was a real person, a lawyer who lived some 5 centuries ago in England. King Henry VIII had such a high regard for More's character, his integrity, and his rational thoughtfulness that he appointed him High Chancellor of England. But then came Henry's messy divorce from his wife, against the rulings of the Roman Catholic Church, in order to marry his mistress. More could not, in good conscience, sign the king's oath of supremacy, accepting the king as the head of the church in England. More was accused of treason, arrested, imprisoned, convicted, and executed by beheading in 1535. About 90 years ago, the Catholic Church, declaring More a martyr for the faith, canonized him a saint. Now, we can know very little about what the real historical More said, let alone what his motives were. So the dialogue in the film of 1966, by the way, and in Robert Bolt's play of 1960, on which the film is based, that dialogue has to be fictional. But what can we know of the character in the movie and the play? Knowing the characters' actions and their consequences is not enough. Even knowing the circumstances, providing context for those actions and consequences, is not enough. We need to consider his motives. Yet we cannot know another person's motives for certain. We can only make educated guesses here, realizing that deception and even self-deception are permanent possibilities. I define a human being as a personal animal. That is to say, both physically and socially a member of the animal kingdom, and mentally or spiritually a personal animal. As a person, he or she is both a thinking being and a moral agent. As a thinking being, he or she is capable of developing and exercising reason and free choice. As a person, he or she has or can develop character, which can either be good character or bad character. That's my philosophy of human nature, and it's essentially the philosophy of human nature of the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. I want to use this philosophical perspective tonight to analyze how the films and also the play's character seems to fulfill his potential as a human being. In an excellent book entitled Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, Kant analyzes human nature in these three dimensions. First, we are animals. That is to say, we are living, physical organisms of the animal type. Second, we are humans. That is, living animals that are rational. And third, we are persons. That is, we develop into free moral agents accountable for at least some of our actions. A technical term for Kant's ethics, which some of you have already studied and others perhaps will study in the near future, a technical term for Kant's ethics is deontology. Fancy word meaning that it is duty-based. It's based on duty. Duty is what drives the ethical theory. It's duty-based in that a good person of virtuous moral character tries to discern and to do his or her duty. What I want to argue here is that the films and also the play's characterization of More is that of a person of whom Kant and his followers, including me, should approve. Let us analyze More from Kant's three perspectives of animal, human, and person. and then consider how he seems to practice Kantian ethical deontology. First, More, while certainly not coarse or crude, is down to earth and practical. As an animal, he inhabits his body comfortably. He lives well, and he seems to enjoy his good fortune. He's sociable, caring about others, and relating to them gracefully. He seems to like people, including his servant Matthew, identified as a common man, including the untrustworthy, social climbing Richard Rich, and including Senor Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador and a potential political adversary. Second, while More has deep-seated feelings, as a human, he's always eminently rational. He thinks things through in such a way as to figure out what he believes to be best. Trained as a lawyer, he's careful in minding the likely consequences of his actions. For example, when he breaks off his friendship with the Duke of Norfolk, it is to save his friend from persecution and not for any selfish reasons. When his family visits him in prison near the end of the story, he sadly realizes that unless he conforms to royal demands, he will die soon and never see any of his family again. Third, as a person, he is a moral agent who is responsible for his decisions. Being accountable for the way he uses his freedom, More consistently follows his conscience, doing whatever he thinks is right, even if nobody else seems to agree with him. The story is interesting partly because it portrays a real person facing a life and death dilemma. As a loyal subject of the king, he has a duty to obey royal commands, and he's very mindful of that duty. But doing so in this situation requires him to turn against his religion and violate his higher duty to God. This he cannot do in good conscience. For Kant, a virtuous person is one who has developed and exercises good traits of rational choice and conduct. Such a person habitually tries to do what is right. Kant's ultimate ethical principle, called the categorical imperative, requires that we try to treat all persons, ourselves as well as others, with respect, and that we never use any person merely as a means to other ends. Kant maintains that this requires that we strive for our own moral improvement and for the well-being of others. We owe ourselves prudent self-care and self-improvement, and we owe others honesty and beneficence. Furthermore, we should never adopt immoral courses of action, even if they are the only possible means to the good ends that are desired. In his Anthropology, Kant maintains that a person who acts on principle rather than on inclination has character. This is a reliable person of whom one knows what to expect. Such a character is Thomas More. More's character, as portrayed in the film as well as in the play on which that film is based, More's character is consistently virtuous. Everything he says, everything he does, supports the view that his life was genuinely and reliably exemplary. Now, whether or not that was equally true of the historical Thomas More is a matter for conjecture, but after all, he was officially proclaimed a saint. Having developed this Kantian analysis of the character of More, let us consider a couple of critical questions. In other words, what might somebody say against the character Sir Thomas More and the way that character is represented in the movie and the play? So I'm going to consider two possible criticisms that might have some weight to them here. First, is there anything to be said against the choices More makes and his consequent actions? The play and the movie are obviously designed to make it look like this is a man of principle. He's acting on his principles and he's maintaining his integrity. He's a good man. Whether or not he's deluded is another matter, but he's doing what he thinks is right, and we're supposed to admire that. But now the question I'm asking is, might there be anything said against More and what he does? Well, if we adopt a very different perspective from the Kantian one, there could be. The clearest alternative for our purposes may well be that of utilitarianism. Many of you have already studied utilitarianism. Others of you, no doubt, will before you get out of Gonzaga. Utilitarianism, the theory that the ultimate good is human happiness, and that our moral duty is to try to make as many people as possible as happy as possible. From this utilitarian angle, how should More be evaluated? If happiness is the measure of right and wrong. It's arguable that More's choice stubbornly to refuse to take the king's oath of supremacy led to the foreseeable consequences of making nobody happy. The king was unhappy. The officials who had to deal with More were unhappy. His friends were unhappy. His family was unhappy. And not being an anarchist, More himself was unhappy. It seems clear enough that More's choices and actions here fail the utilitarian test and are by that standard wrong. But I'm not a utilitarian. As valuable as human happiness is, and I think it is valuable, I believe in following ethical principles and maintaining moral integrity, as Thomas More did. The hypocritical, insincere taking of an oath violated More's conscience, and desirable ends could not for him justify evil means. So that's one line of criticism possible, and an attempt to answer it from the Kantian point of view. Here comes the second criticism that I've considered. Secondly, however true to the actual character of the historical More this representation of him in the film and the play may have otherwise been from a Kantian perspective, More is presented as a practically perfect person. At the risk of sounding cynical, one might wonder if this representation isn't too good to be true. Well, this is a judgment call, but I'm going to make it anyhow. Although, of course, practically perfect people are few and far between, I think there are some. I'm thinking, for example, of such moral heroes in real life as Siddhartha Gautama, called the Buddha, Jesus of Nazareth, Immanuel Kant himself, John Stuart Mill, arguably the most famous utilitarian, Abraham Lincoln, and Mother Teresa. So no, I don't think the representation is necessarily too good to be true. And if I'm right that there are some practically perfect people, however few they may be, then they can inspire the rest of us to do our best to fulfill our own human nature and maintain virtuous character. In conclusion, like all great films, and I suppose like all great plays, A Man for All Seasons is thought-provoking and even fascinating on account of its portrayal of a protagonist who is worth getting to know. So if you ever need an example of a movie that portrays an inspiring and uplifting role model, consider A Man for All Seasons. It was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, and it won 6 of them. So it almost swept the Academy Awards in 1966. Oh, and by the way, before I finish, if you want a tool for analyzing that film, you might consider Kant's Philosophy for All Seasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. What did we decide? We had a debate. Do you want to go? Oh, Tyler's going to go. Okay, all right. Dr. Tritten.
Does the microphone pick me up back here in a way that it doesn't if I stand forward? We don't know. It's not obvious.
Well, no, we're actually not using.
Oh, we're not using the microphone. Okay, all right.
We
Then
are
I'll stand up
using
here.
a microphone for the camera.
Then no, it's not. Okay. So good. He's plugged in right now. May or may not be paying attention. He said he's motioning and hear me. But I got some notes on this paper from my son there, Sebastian Felix Tritten. I'm going to say scathing things about Inside Out, and he gave me some criticisms, of which I thought at least one was very good. We can maybe talk about in the Q&A. And then I also have some good things to say about Seinfeld, which may have redeemed me completely in his eyes. Not completely, but I'll take what I can get. All right. So the title here is Character and Cinema, subtitle Time and Image. As every science has its object, surely every medium has a truth most appropriate to it. For instance, as the plastic arts and painting are better suited for the exposition of lived space, more so than rather say poetry, I likewise contend that cinema is best suited for the exposition of time and character. That is not to say, of course, that other mediums may not be just as or even more appropriate for the exposition of character development. For example, the novel, or of time, for example, music. But of those truths that cinema can reveal, I argue that character and time are primary to it. Prima facie, this claim might strike one as patently false, as cinema deals in images, and neither character nor time is an image, that is to say, a sense datum. I can't, touch a character, smell a character, whatever, right? Or a personality, as it were. Henri Bergson, for instance, who indefatigably argues that our inability adequately to think time stems from our pragmatic and natural penchant to conceive time in terms of space, sometimes speaks of the spatialization of time as the, quote, cinematographic. So for Bergson, the cinematographic names in principle this error of conceiving of things that are fundamentally temporal in spatial terms, right? Cinema, no matter how fast the shutter speed may be, can only yield, Bergson laments, a contiguous series of images, but never a continuum, never actual durée, or sort of continuous duration that's not sort of carved up into instants. Moreover, by virtue of this fact, more so than in a novel or a score of music, the content of a film is in principle given in advance, as the director might simply order and reorder the frames. Now, of course, in a book, the ending's given in advance too, like you can flip forward to the end, right? Or in a piece of music, the score's there. But I don't think in quite such a plastic way as in the film, where you'll just, skip forward 10 minutes and the ending is already there, right? Such that time would have really no real role to play. Thus, it seems that there can be no character development in time, but only the arrangement in space of the discrete components of a character. It is precisely for this reason that I will soon criticize the unfortunately highly acclaimed film Inside Out. Nevertheless, despite my forthcoming misgiving with Inside Out, and despite Bergson's employment of the cinematographic as an analogy for the fallacious spatialization of time, I argue that cinema is particularly well suited to portray time, and, insofar as it presupposes temporal development as its sine qua non, character. Right? There's no character without time. As Gilles Deleuze insists, who has likely done more than anyone to resurrect Bergson's legacy in France and elsewhere, cinema just is the motion of durée. That is to say, cinema is kinematics. Right? And this is where the word cinema comes from, is like kinesis, so a motion, a movement, and not just still frames, right? And cinema's image is accordingly a time image, hence the two-part book series by Deleuze, Cinema 1, the movement image, Cinema 2, the time image. I do not have the time to unpack the distinction between these two images, except to say that neither is static and both are continuous rather than discrete. It may seem then that Bergson regards the medium of cinema as appropriate only for the exposition of space, conceived partes ex partes, parts outside of parts, while Deleuze finds cinema uniquely equipped to present time, conceived as the continuity of duration. This contrast, however, is likely more ephemeral than real, as Bergson's interest was not to uncover the essence of the cinematic as the thing to be explained, but he instead only employed the cinematographic as an analogy, or something to help illustrate and explain our persistent misconception of time as space. Bergson himself is keen to point out that even in a photo, for example, a still frame, say of a soccer player with his foot forward on the ball, one perceives both the preceding motion of the kick and the ensuing flight of the ball. Even in the still frame, we don't actually just see that tiny little instant, right? Before our intellect theoretically analyzes the still frame, artificially isolating its movement into the punctual, everyone perceives durée, or motion therein. We actually see the soccer player kick the ball. Not me, I'd obviously fall. But a soccer player could do it. So the present is a thick present that carries forward a past motion into a future trajectory, says Bergson. My claim then is really twofold. First, Bergson's castigation of the cinematographic should not necessarily be read as an indictment against cinema itself, film itself. And second, cinema, when done well, is an image of durée, or duration, or time, that is therefore highly suited for the revelation of character. Not all cinema, in other words, even for Bergson, must be cinematographic, which in essence means cinematopography, spatialization of movement, the space image. But it can also be kinematics, a movement image, a time image. The title of my presentation today, Character in Cinema, may therefore just as well be called Character and Time Image, or Character and Time, if you will. To make my claim more concrete, I'll first briefly critique a film that does cinema topographically, and then offer some possible examples of the properly kinematic. So, first the bad. Inside Out is bad cinema. That is to say, bad kinematics. The film treats character, persona, as, to speak Humean, a bundle of images where perceptions enter and memories are formed as discrete bits of data transmitted through tubes and read as information that is then used to stitch together a character in complete isolation, or in principle, possible isolation, from the order the perceptions occurred and the order the memories formed. They're just now in a big heap of information, right? Character thus loses its bond with durée, as each experience in memory is discretized, atomized, and literally stored in a container until it's ready to find expression and association with others that have no essential link to it. Character, personal identity, is thus, in Inside Out, a spatial assemblage of components, a compilation, but not growth and development through time. Inside Out's fallacies are as follows. 1, the atomization of experience. 2, the reduction of experience to information or data. 3, the abstraction or false isolation of this data from the continuum in which it originally occurs, experience as continuous. 4, representation, that is to say the translation of these bits of experience into emotions that subsequently re-dramatize the data as existentially meaningful. And finally, 5, the restitching of human identity and character by means of this information being discharged by equally discrete emotions. Anger, sadness, envy, joy, etc. Hence, the whole movement is centrifugal, that is to say, inside out. Instead, as both Bergson and Deleuze forcefully insist, conscious self-identity cannot be presupposed as a stable and pre-constituted substrate that receives experience only to emote it outwardly. Character or personal identity itself must first be hollowed out or constituted centripetally, outside in. So first of all, the film shouldn't even be inside out. They should have made the film outside in, right? That would be a better film, right? The question is not how a subject can get outside itself or how external data can pierce its interiority, but the first question should rather be how a subject first emerges imminent to experience itself. How can experience itself attain inwardness? This would be a much better question, I think. Inside-out's fallacies incline toward an informational and machinic conception of the self, which in turn entails determinism. If we are but a bundle of spatially isolable sensations translated into emotive representations discharged outwardly, then there's nothing more in the input than in the ingredients, and determinism is the natural consequence. Due to limited time, I will leave further explanation and implications for the Q&A. But suffice it to say that in my opinion, Inside Out fails as a piece of cinema, though it does thrive pedagogically as an exemplary instance of the cinematographic in Bergson. To offer a few possibilities of good kinematics, particularly with respect to its capacity to reveal character, I suggest the characters of Bob Sacamino in Seinfeld, plugged in, hopefully watching it, Bob Sacamino in Seinfeld, Baltimore in The Wire, The Sled in Rosebud, and Useless Passion in Agir der Sohn Gottes, or Werner Herzog film Agir, The Wrath of God. So television too can be kinematic, yes? Bob Sacamino is a friend of Kramer's who is frequently discussed but never appears on screen. Seinfeld constructs a character with temporal growth and development without the use of an image at all. Bob Sacamino is a pure time image and not at all a space image. Although the viewer is shown many images of the city of Baltimore in The Wire, the revelation of Baltimore's character has to do with the movement of the story, its direction, its twists and turns. Shots of the city, in my opinion at least, are but packaging or ornamental. The character of Baltimore is revealed through the flow of its dramatization, the durée of its dramatization. The character of the city is more than its image, as well as more than the assemblage of the figures integral to the plot. Baltimore has its own durée, Baltimore has its own character. In Rosebud, the main character is not even something with its own movement or dynamism, like a city, but an inert object, a sled. Yet, the character of the sled is not revealed through its visible images, but through the role the sled plays in the movement and progression of the protagonist's history. The protagonist, however, is not the lead, but the sled itself is the main character. The protagonist is the means to the revelation of the character of the sled, Rosebud, after which the film is titled, and not the inverse. In all these cases, character is not revealed through surfaces, through the visible, through the space image, through the cinematographic, but through a genetic history, which requires real time, real duration. The durée might even be expressed in boredom. Terrence Malick, I find, is a master at this. He bores his viewer because the time between events is more important than anything that appears and happens. That is more important than the scenes and the acts that drive the plot. So I don't know how long we can get a shot of a flower or something of the sort, right? Similarly, if Werner Herzog wants to display the futility of human striving in Agir der Sohn Gottes, then he presents the viewer with a nauseating excess of Klaus Kinski, the actor, doing absolutely nothing except floating on a wooden raft for about 90 minutes, right? But the time matters, how long you have to do this. The character of boredom or suffering is reproduced in the viewer and only through the imposition of time. Time is essential, not accidental. Cinema, kinematics, has as its object the time image, which is to say that its magic is to make the imageless appear. If painting's insight, not the insight of the painter, does not concern an object in space, but the truth of spatialization itself, cinema's insight, not necessarily the insight of the filmmaker, does not concern an event or narrative occurring within time, but the truth of temporalization itself, which is the sine qua non of character. Thanks.
Dr. Layne, we'll get you hooked up here. Right? Here we go.
Okay, so a few thoughts before I click on these slides. So first off, thank you, Professor Calhoun, for inviting all of us to be here to talk a little philosophy and a little film. Second off, I'm going to do mine on something that is a little different than my previous speakers. First off, I'd like to emphasize, as Professor Tritten did, that the word cinema comes from the Greek kinesis, right? To move. They're etymologically connected, so the moving image. And so one of the things that I'm going to do here is to talk about archetypes, right? So one of the things I think is great about Inside Out is it seems to be thinking about the family systems within, or these archetypes of personality that seem to exist prior to my even being a kind of person, right? There's certain figures of the mother or certain figures of the father that exist somewhat within, as they do in Inside Out, and then we're dealing with them, right? That we put them out there, so that there's a weird combination of there being an essential aspect to your personality that you give form to in your actions and in the way that you move through this world. And so this weird paradoxical aspect of the human condition where we both have and don't have an essence, that we both give and don't give to ourselves in some strange way. And so I want to argue that what film really does, insofar as film does this work of showing us these archetypes, these kinds of characters who do the work of being imperfectly impractical individuals, right? And in their imperfection, in their lack of what we would call typical rationality, they show us what giving virtue is, or the bestowing virtue is, the inspiring virtue of what it means to be in a film, or the main character in a film, trying to inspire us to remember we have this same kind of power, or the same tendency. Yep. Oh, and the thing that I think that unites the character I'm going to talk about, the archetypical character of the goddess Metis. So Metis is the goddess, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her in just a second, of cleverness, the kind of wisdom that is cunning, kind of personality that's unafraid to lie, but is also the source, depending on mythological origins, the source of all things, right? The source for survival. I would argue that philosophy and rational thinking grow and emerge from this cunning wisdom of I need to survive, right? And that without this, we wouldn't have what we would typically call philosophy, or elbow patch wearing, sitting around there thinking of systems, so on and so forth. You're not wearing elbow patches today, right? No, just making sure. Okay. And that in this, despite the fact that none of these people, or this character, this Metis character, is going to be immoral in the typical sense. When we think, somebody opposed to more, somebody opposed to, this little girl growing up and trying to be a good person, that strangely, in their imperfection and their immorality, they show and inspire us to believe in the good, the true, and the just. But the good, the true, and the just as eternal things, film has a great way of showing that they are evolving eternal things. The way that they appear or are embodied are never going to look the same from one generation to the next. And the Metis type character is a kind of hero or heroine that can in fact show us that in the immorality, in a kind of godlessness, there is still this godly, inspired way of life, because you're committed to evolving life, committed to needing to survive and to recreate the image of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Okay. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so here, just to talk about your classic representation of Metis, or the goddess Metis, we have to remember what we most often think about if you know who this character is. Metis was the first wife of Zeus, okay? And so Zeus had heard from Metis, in fact, that she was going to give birth to the god that would overthrow him. He's just won a battle with the Titans. He doesn't want to be overthrown already. And you know what? She just found out she was pregnant. And so upon hearing the joyous news of his expected child, he quickly takes her, swallows her, eats her, and now Zeus' power has this cunning wisdom, this strategic wisdom within, right? But of course, like a bad tuna sandwich on a hot day, Metis kind of rumbles around in him, and ultimately he gets a headache, and boom, out springs Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who is, on all intents and purposes, the, good daughter, right? She serves all of his needs, so now power, as typically construed, has all that cunning wisdom, and it's been transformed into this wisdom that serves Zeus. Now, eventually, that's all going to come full circle, where we'll kind of think about the fact that Metis perhaps just transformed herself, that what Athena is Metis reborn. And this is what I mean by the archetypical nature in mythology, where characters like Metis get consumed, but then are redeployed and remade again for a new generation, so that ultimately Athena becomes the patron saint of Athens, almost more important than your Zeus-like characters, but we'll get into that in a minute. All right. So things about the character Metis. Here, I'll read this quote for French philosopher Vervant. Metis' intelligence, which operates in the world of becoming, in circumstances of conflict, takes the form of an ability to deal with whatever comes up, drawing on certain intellectual qualities: forethought, perspicacity, quickness, acuteness of understanding, trickery, and even deceit. But these qualities bring into play the weapons which are their own particular attribute: elusiveness and duplicity, like spells which they use to oppose brute force. So Metis is going to be that kind of wisdom that knows how to push back against powers that be, things that are so large, people with all the guns or all the money. This kind of wisdom allows you to be the David before the Goliath, okay? A being of Metis slips through its adversary's fingers like running water. It is so supple as to be polymorphic, to have many shapes, and Metis could change her shape just like many other gods in Greek mythology. Like a trap, it is the opposite of what it seems to be. It is ambiguous, inverted, and operates through a process of reversal. So I would argue that good characters, weirdly, paradoxically, don't grow. They actually figure out ways to evolve and look different, and then survive. Go on to live another day, have a different prosopon or mask or face that allows for that evolution, right? And so that evolution is a way of continuing to create in such a way that that weird personality can stay the same, it can survive. And that being a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. All right, so basically I have some fun keywords. Polytropos means they have many pathways they can go, they have many ideas, snapping, firing. Kairos, they're pretty good at knowing the right time to act. They will wait, they'll be patient, they'll be clever that way. They're cunning, wise, inventive, particularly in arts, right? So in making machines, in making strategies that will allow for new inventions. Typically, you only get their real personality in the intimacy of the catching them in a lie or wanting them to tell their story. You really won't get them as they are, if you do get them as they, if you get their personality in public, they tend to take on a more brooding, quiet, not so giving away of their secrets. They're unpredictable, tend to be subversive, mercurial, and like I said, evolving, not in the sense of changing, but doing something other to continue to be what they essentially are, and to recreate themselves in that process. And I know that sounds paradoxical, but that's the same idea. This kind of, they are these kinds of characters who have that paradoxical being, both self-creating, but already trying to show you that what they are is something inspired, ergo divine or essential, something otherwise than the normal human being. Okay? All right. So, I thought I would go and look at some fun movies in order to kind of pick out some of these characters that we see over and over again that are unique. Each character has something a little different to offer because that's a different prosopon, another mask that this character often has. And so we see this a lot in today's action films. We've got the very clever female character who knows how to invent, right? Who's not afraid to break the rules, who's not afraid to do things otherwise with regards to the material resources that they have. They have a kind of mercurial relationship. So we think of Shuri here as one that I actually think is probably an easy one, right? Where she's a warrior, right? But she's also gifted, right, with regards to making things from the materials of her world, right? And she's not afraid to make technology that kind of pushes against the grain, that people are like, no, you shouldn't do that with this. So she doesn't have a kind of dogmatic rule about what the right way of thinking is. And so she's able to invent and strategize and come up with different kinds of things. Same with Furiosa, in even more kind of medic terms with regards to the theme of survival and this ever-evolving form of maternity and giving birth to new ideas that ultimately just safeguard the old, that bring about these relationships that are eternal. Okay. And I'm going fast because I want to make sure that we have time for a good discussion, so please forgive me. If you were one of my students, I would say you get used to it after a semester, so I apologize. Okay, oops, I went back. All right. These women also tend to be quiet leaders, the actual reason why the plot and the action occurs. So we've got General, I forgot now her Origami? No, it's not. Origami? I don't know. Leia! Princess Leia! I don't care. She's both general and princess. See here this paradoxical nature, or she could be both. And if it wasn't for Leia, if it wasn't for Trinity in the Matrix, Neo would never have gotten out. Willing to sacrifice themselves, right? Using their wisdom, their cunningness to put things into computers like R2-D2. No, it is R2-D2. Or Trinity, beating her partner up, because there's not a morality there. She's got to show him the truth. We're going to use lies, deceptions, white rabbit tricks, all this fun stuff, because there is no morality morality is not moral for them if it does not evolve into the contextual situation. Okay? Same with Furiosa and Shuri, like thinking about, yes, for Shuri, there's a logic to making certain kinds of things, but if you don't break that logic, you're never going to invent what's going to actually help you survive. All right. Oh, yeah. And so that here, they teach that life and transcendence emerge through connection, that Neo is not all by himself, Luke is not all by themselves, that they need other people to organize and to stimulate, to come up with the strategies. I mean, Luke is a whimpering baby without his team. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you've seen episode 4, you know what I'm talking about. And, I would say that same arguably with regards to Neo and Trinity. If it wasn't for Trinity, I don't know if I could have handled the bad acting of, what is our friend's name? Keanu Reeves. No, I'm joking. I love Keanu Reeves. He's a great guy. But the point is that these Matus characters know they need a team. Know that what you need to do is to break the mold of a good person and be within a community where you may be the one who is strategizing, manipulating, maybe even spreading lies for the sake of survival. All right. They also seem to be able to utilize their sense of inspiration, their sense of the more than, the sense of the transcendence, the sense of the duty that doesn't have a script, right? That virtue doesn't tell you what exactly it is to be virtuous, right? Doesn't tell you what exactly it is to be ingenious, right? And so they're open to the foreign or the alien. They hear voices they ought not. So a kind of reason that causes inspiration, that causes a kind of madness, that people are like, no, you can't do it that way, Shuri. You can't do it that way, Dr. Lewis Banks from Arrival. So you've got these people who are willing to bend time, willing to travel in ways that are completely irrational. And if they don't, then we lose the good, the true, and the beautiful. Everything is at stake. We're trying to survive, so we're evolving. We're not changing, we're learning to do something different for the sake of the human being, or for the sake of the planet, so that it remains. So again, film captures these eternal ideas in ways that show that those eternal ideas cannot be imaged or look the same from image to image to image. Right? I have a duty to disrupt the narrative in order to highlight the beauty of a certain kind of character that is eternal. All right? And so they're able to communicate with the alien because they're able to think this way. They're able to take their cunningness and their strategy and think, hear, experience time in the case of Dr. Banks, wholly otherwise than most people. All right. Okay, and this is my final. Right, and again, I told you I'm going fast because I know that we've got one more speaker, and I know that we'll only have a certain amount of time for Q&A. But one of the things that I find really interesting about most characters that embody this Metis type is a kind of anonymity, right? A kind of, they don't need to be the hero, even though without them there would be no saving Wakanda. There would be no saving Australia. There would be no saving the galaxy. Who are missing? Oh yeah, the Matrix, people in the Matrix. They are the fulcrum. They are the wisdom that made all of those things possible. But at the end of the day, these women know that their wisdom, right, was for the good of this world, the community, not their prestige. So Metis isn't a very popular god, even though within the mythology, she is the first, right? She is born from the Chaos, right? And Chronos, this is pre-being, so this is Orphic mythology. And she's born as an Orphic egg, this thing that ends up being full of tension and then cracks open, and she becomes this bearer of light. And so that her first instantiation is, she gets 3 names, Metis, Phanes, and this weird obscure name, Erpeos. Don't worry, I can explain that if you really want to know that. But ultimately, her instantiation as Phanes means that she gives birth to the night, and the night is the place of prophecy. So all beings after night have to actually go to her daughter prophecy, or nooks, the darkness, so to go into